This is Author Talk, brought to you by Author House, the leading provider of services to help authors publish, promote, and sell their books. Author Talk is produced by Toginet Radio, on the web at toginet.com.
Greetings for Steve Jorgensen and for Author Talk. This is J. Douglas Barker. The title of the book is Donald's Story, One Family's Journey Through the Tangled Darkness of Alzheimer's, How to Cope and Survive as Your Loved One Slips Away. Our author, Gina Moreno Wilson.
I see you staring out your window, searching for your past. A lifetime full of memories slipping through your grasp. You see those pictures on the mantle, tell the story of your life. A glimpse into your history of days long past by. When the photos start to fade, when the memories slip away, it's a struggle every day. I will remind you when you look at me and say you see a face without a name, perfect strangers in a frame. I will remind you. You see that picture taken long ago of a boy who's 3, blowing out his candles, sitting on your knee. Now that child is all grown up now. Yes, that boy is me, standing right beside you, where I wanna be. When the photos start to fade, when the memories slip away, it's a struggle every day. I will remind you when you look at me and say you see a face without a name, perfect strangers in a frame. I will remind you, I will always be there to hold your hand, like you've always been for me. And together we can beat this in the end, 'cause I can be your memory. Even when the darkest clouds pass by, you'll always find there's hope. Eventually the sun breaks through to form a rainbow. Every day we'll make new memories to add them to this shelf, always to remind you you're never by yourself. When the photos start to fade, when the memories slip away, it's a struggle every day. I will remind you when you look at me and say you see a face without a name, perfect strangers in a frame. I will remind you when the photos start to fade, when the memories slip away, it's a struggle every day. I will remind you when you look at me and say you see a face without a name, perfect strangers in a frame. I will remind
Name. Gina, tell my listeners the story behind Donald's story.
Well, Donald is the name of my father. My father passed away in 2010 from Alzheimer's disease, one of the leading causes of dementia. And I wrote this book, Donald's Story, to be his voice. As you might know, if you're familiar with the disease at all, one of the final symptoms of Alzheimer's disease is that it robs the individual of his or her ability to speak. And this was very difficult for me, having been the caregiver for my father, primarily along with my mother, to watch his deterioration, particularly in the last year. And I just knew that I had to be my dad's voice. I had to not just tell his story, because he was an absolutely wonderful and unique human being, but also to reach out to other families who might be going through the same or similar type experience and see if I could bring some good out of the horrific horror which we had been living as a family.
Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. I had a neighbor who developed it at a very young age, in my opinion. He was just, I think, 50 years old. And we watched as he began to lose his memory, lose his way, and eventually had to be put into hospice care and did pass away. So it's a very tough disease, and his family had a history of it. Does your family have an additional history of Alzheimer's?
Well, that is a frightening thing, in fact, because, yes, my dad's mother also passed away from terminal dementia. She was not diagnosed at the time because this is actually a relatively new phenomenon in terms of diagnosing the elderly who become demented with a terminal illness such as Alzheimer's. While the disease itself might not be new, the diagnosis, in a sense, is relatively new. When my grandmother was ill, for example, Jay, she went from nursing home to nursing home and was expelled time and time again for what they considered behavioral issues. But looking back now, these weren't behavioral issues. This was disease. And we can see that now because the pattern repeated itself with my father. So we've come a long way in terms of being able to recognize the symptoms and the progression of Alzheimer's and similar dementing illnesses. But yes, there's a family history. Now, it's not early onset in the sense that, my dad was elderly when he passed. He was 85 years old. However, with hindsight, we can see that some of the beginning observable symptoms were present probably 15, maybe 20 years prior.
Gina, was there a particular event that led to the admission of your father into hospital or hospice care?
When he was finally put into full-time institutional type care, this is something we tried to avoid for a long time, and my mother did her best to keep him at home with her. And I live very close by, and I was always there attending as best I could, being a single mother, and also I was working as a full-time elementary school principal. So as you can imagine, this was a difficult situation.
Yes.
But, I actually opened the book with the very dramatic events that led to our decision that we had no choice. He had to go into a facility where someone could care for him. In terms of repetitious habits, what happened with my dad is that, there would be sporadic times of hallucinations or delusions. And obviously the memory loss, those types of incidents had been occurring here and there for a number of years. But it's funny, looking back, and I comment on this in the book, as a caregiver and as a family member, we do a very good job in denying what we're observing. And as a family, we would say, Dad's just, he's getting forgetful, or gee, that was odd, he said something weird, but then you just pass over it because the thing about Alzheimer's disease is that the person might exhibit some type of strange behavior. For example, my dad might reach for the salad dressing and put it on his steak instead of his salad, but then in the next moment, he would have a completely lucid conversation with you and seem just fine and want to play a card game. And you go through months, even years, of this type of bouncing back and forth. Is he ill or is he not ill? Is there something wrong or is there something not wrong? Maybe it's me. This is part and parcel of the disease, and it's also what distinguishes this disease from other terminal illnesses, I think, in terms of the process of grieving which families go through. And, again, I don't have experience yet losing someone to a disease other than this, but in studying the literature in terms of the Kubler-Ross model of grief, there seems to be a fairly typical progression.
Gina, in my observations of people who are caregivers, there tends to be, especially if they're family members, the caregiver tends to get into a state of denial. Did that take place in your family as well?
I think that's very true. It was particularly true for my mother, who would justify the behaviors that she observed with my father until there really was no justification left. The neurologist even commented on this to me, that she was exhibiting typical symptoms of denial. And I think the reason being, Jake, at least for us, was that, to admit that this is a problem, to admit that this is something outside of the norm, would require action on our part and acceptance.
Right.
It would require acceptance that this is not normal aging, that the plans that my parents had made for the previous 60 years were not going to take place, that they were not going to grow old together. They were old, they were elderly, but they were not going to spend those final years, when you think you need that person the most in your final illness, they were going to be separated, and it just throws a wrench into your life. And so, acceptance also requires action. Well, if this is true, if I accept that this is, Alzheimer's disease and not just forgetfulness or senility, then what does that mean? That means that I have to do something other than what I do. And for my mom, that was just incomprehensible and too painful. And in fact, when my father was finally diagnosed, it was because of increasing hallucinations. My dad looked at her one day, they were in the car, and he was acting perfectly normal. They had gone to the grocery store, they were driving home, and then at a stoplight he just turned and looked at her and said, "Do you know Gina?" And she looked at him. I mean, that's me, obviously, their daughter. And she said, "Yes, of course I know Gina." And he says, "Oh, well, do you live around here?" He had no idea who she was at that moment.
Right.
And so, it was these type of incidences that began to become more frequent until finally, as I chronicled in the first chapter of my book, it came a point where I received a phone call at work, and my dad had tried to kill my mother in a parking lot. And I received a call from strangers who had found my name and number in my mother's purse. And when I arrived, there was an ambulance, there were police cars, there were, strangers gathered around. My dad was being held by the police. There was blood on the pavement. And, and I looked and I thought, can this be real? I mean, it seems like something out of a movie. I mean, my parents were very typical, middle-class folks, My dad is part of that greatest generation, those World War II vets, just, kind of Dean Martin style, very laid-back, warm Italian man, loving, calm. I never even saw him yell. I mean, if he got mad, he would kind of take it outside because that was the way he was raised, You didn't, he was mild-mannered, and this was just completely atypical and uncharacteristic. And, I think for my mom, that was just something that she found that she could not deal with. And when we finally, at that point, I had to deal with it, and for her own protection, that's when we made the decision as a family that this had to change.
Caregivers have observed that many people going through this type of illness that's terminal will do repetitive things. They'll fold a napkin over and over again, perhaps a newspaper, read it and fold it and read it, or some other repetitive action. This harkens back to, as a housewife perhaps, her doing her laundry and folding clothes and putting them in a way for them to compartmentalize and take control of an area of their brain that's not functioning well. This seems to give them a sense of comfort that they are completing a task that they did well when they were younger. That seems to come back and is a way that provides them with some sense of satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment when they're going through this terminal illness. Gina, I'm sure you had a target market when you began to assemble your thoughts and tell your story. Who do you think will benefit from it the most?
Well, as a caregiver, I searched for answers anywhere and everywhere. I was in the bookstore, I was in the library, I was online, I talked to anyone and everyone because I was so frustrated. I was hoping to find something to give me comfort. And so I think, obviously, primarily, it's my hope that those who have a journey that's similar to the one I took will find some comfort just in knowing that they're not alone. Alzheimer's is an isolating disease because it's something that requires round-the-clock care. It doesn't go away. And I think that, those families are the primary audience. That being said, however, I have tried to weave through the narrative tips for families and for individuals who are coping with any type of traumatic adversity because, the experience of loving deeply and losing someone you love is universal.
Yes.
None of us are immortal here. And we're born into families and into relationships where we develop bonds, and inevitably those bonds are broken by death. So that experience is common to all of us. And to that experience, I try to shed some light of hope that regardless of the separation caused by illness or death, that the love remains and love survives the physical death and the suffering. And my father really, he exemplified that. He had become virtually nonverbal at the end, which is, part and parcel of the illness. Yet 2 days before he died, my sister was sobbing on his shoulder, and he was patting her back, and clear as a bell, he said, "It's okay, don't cry. It's okay, don't cry." Clear as a bell. And it's, that's just one of several unique experiences I had with my dad at the end of his journey here. But that would be my message, that this is about Alzheimer's disease, but it's about so much more than that. It's about finding your way through traumatic adversity. It's about coping with loss. It's about the endurance of family love.
Is there some practical advice also that developed in this process that you can pass along?
I do try to give at the end of each chapter what I call survival tips. And these are just, some of them are very practical, some of them are more philosophical, but they're things to bear in mind. I do deal in one chapter with some of those more practical matters that families will need to address, such as financial matters, dealing with family tension, planning for your final illness. One thing I would say, whole books have been written on those types of topics. But the one thing that I think is important to address, and I would like to point out here, is that, when an illness like this strikes, Alzheimer's is somewhat insidious. You don't really know that it's creeping up on you. And therefore, by the time it's recognizable, you may not have all of your faculties to make the decisions you would have wanted to make. I tried as best I could to make the decisions that I thought my dad would want, having known him all my life. But as an individual, it made me, take notice that, okay, I now have committed to paper what my beliefs are, what my desires are, what I want done. Should I not be able to make those decisions for myself? And, time is not endless. Sometimes it is too late. And so that is one tip that I would pass on to people is take notice. Even if it's as simple as writing something down on a sheet of paper in your handwriting, this is what's important to me and this is how I want my last days to go. I think that's an important thing to remember and do. And I do address some of those matters in a chapter in the book about practical questions.
You've assembled a very practical and a very important narrative about your dad's life, 162 pages, including some wonderful family photos. Was there anything that was challenging about putting this book together?
None of it was fun, Jay. I will tell you that. But at some point, I knew I had to complete this work. It didn't start off me sitting down saying, I'm going to write a book about my dad. That's not how this went. I was in survival mode myself. As I said, I had a lot of professional responsibilities. I ran a school with hundreds of children and a large staff. I was a single mother. I had an elderly mother and an ill father, and my siblings lived hundreds of miles away. So for me, survival was late at night, after the children were in bed, when I could do no more and I was back home, I would write. And it was a journal. Between writing and running, I managed my way through it. But then the more I wrote, the more I wanted to write. And it did evolve. And someone close to me read what I had written and said, you really should finish this and publish it as a book, because I think other people could be helped by it. And that's, where that went and how that path evolved. But I have to tell you, the end of the book sat unfinished for many, many months. And I was grieving. I had lost my dad at that point, and I just couldn't do it. And I'll give you briefly the impetus for finishing. I was at a convention, unrelated really, and I sat down. I was there by myself. It was shortly after Dad had passed away, and I took a seat. I was waiting for the speaker to come out, and the seat next to me was available, and a lady came and sat down. She was quite talkative. She said, I just feel called to sit by you. Is that okay? And, I thought, oh, geez, she wants to chit-chat, and I'm just really not in the mood. I was polite, but I was quiet. And there were many other seats she could have taken. But she kept trying to engage me in conversation. And finally, tears were starting to spill down my face a little, because I was getting a little frustrated. And I told her, I said, I'm really very sorry. I said, you seem very nice. I said, I'm just not really, in a talkative mode right now, having kind of a hard time in my life. And so, forgive me if I don't want to chat. She said, oh, did you lose someone, dear? That type of thing. And I said, I'm sorry, my dad just passed away. And she said, was it expected? And I said, well, yes and no. He passed from Alzheimer's. At that point, the hair stands up on my arms as I recount this. She pulled out her telephone and pulled up 2 pictures. And in one picture, there were 2 twin beds with 2 middle-aged women laying in them. She said, look at this picture. She said, these are my sisters, and they both have Alzheimer's. And we just both looked at each other. And it was just the strangest moment, one of my life. How does that happen? I don't know. I have no explanation, but it did. And this woman, really, Jay, remarkable woman named Jenny Baker, she is really responsible for helping me to complete the book, in that she followed up with me. She called me the following Father's Day, and she said, I'm just thinking about you, Gina. How is that book coming? And I was still sitting with the last chapters unwritten, and she said, you need to finish it. And I've never forgotten that. I haven't spoken to her since, really, but she made an impact in my life. She was there for a reason. She helped me to finish. It was painful to finish, but I knew I needed to do that. And I feel good about what I've completed here. It's my hope that the book will do some good for other families. That's primarily my point in completing this and trying to get the message out there, because it's a very dark and lonely place to be a caregiver for someone suffering from Alzheimer's disease or similar dementing illness. It's a horrible experience, and yet it's punctuated with moments of joy and moments of hope, because like I said, the illness may at this point, unfortunately there's no cure, may take your loved one, but it doesn't kill their soul and their personality and that human spirit. And that's what I saw with my dad, and that's how I get through it.
Thank you for sharing your story, Gina. Your book has been called a compelling read, an invaluable guidebook, and ultimately an inspirational and motivational tool that reminds us of the power of the human spirit and the enduring nature of true love. The book title again is Donald's Story, One Family's Journey Through the Tangled Darkness of Alzheimer's, and How to Cope with and Survive as Your Loved One Slips Away. Thank you, Gina Moreno Wilson, for joining me today. Where do we get copies of your book?
Well, thank you so much for having me. If you'd like to purchase Donald's Story, it is available at barnesandnoble.com online, as well as amazon.com, or through the Author House website. If you're local to the Las Vegas area, you can also find Donald's Story on the shelves at your local Barnes & Noble. And
do you personally have a website?
Yes, you can contact me through GinaMorenoWilson.com. That's my personal website, through which you can also